What is apartheid? The question comes up whenever people say that Israel is an apartheid state, invoking the universally condemned example of apartheid in South Africa. The point of using the word apartheid is to argue that, given it's agreed that the level of subjugation and oppression involved with apartheid is not just unjustifiable but also unsustainable, the problems between and surrounding the Israelis and Palestinians can be traced back to the apartheid system. So then, what is it? There's been a new understanding of what apartheid is and was in South Africa floating around, primarily promoted by the streamer Destiny, where he essentially argues that apartheid is...
I think of it as like a state dealing with its citizens. So a state controls all of its citizens and it says this race is better than this race and that race is better than that race, and that's it.
The key word there is citizen. Apartheid to Destiny, which according to him historically based on South Africa,
that it was taking citizens that were already recognized citizens of your country and then finding ways to like lock them into these I don't even know how to pronounce it, the Bataustans or whatever, the Batausai, Roroni.
Bantustan.
The thing is, this understanding of apartheid seems to be just made up by Destiny, which I don't mean disrespectfully. I've just never seen or heard of it before him. Even amongst the scholars that suggest that Israel isn't guilty of apartheid, none of them seem to hinge their understanding of apartheid on the citizenship status of a subjugated population. Apartheid, both in the wider usage and specifically in the South African experience, is characterized by the institutionalized racism of a government against the citizens and residents under its sovereign regime. Even Dr. Benny Morris, someone who Destiny seems to agree with on a lot of things, doesn't seem to agree with his interpretation of apartheid.
The problem is that there is apartheid or similar, something along the lines of apartheid in the West Bank, where Israel controls a population which doesn't have rights. It's not racist, incidentally. It's not based on race. It's based on nationalism. There's a discrimination and even separate roads, separate judicial system governing what happens in the West Bank, separate for Jews living in the West Bank and Arabs living in the West Bank. But it's all a derivative of this nationalist struggle and this occupation by Israel of a territory of another people.
Now, Benny Morris not thinking there's racial apartheid, but apartheid based on nationalism should be self-evidently silly, but key is his argument that it is something like apartheid, even though residents in the West Bank don't have Israeli citizenship, something Destiny doesn't push back on. Now, Destiny may have just not mentioned it or has changed his mind since, but all of this is to say that even academics sympathetic to Israel, academics that Destiny has talked to about this topic, haven't stipulated their understanding of apartheid. So then, what is it based on?
If our policy is taken to its logical conclusion, as far as the black man is concerned, there will be not one black man with South African citizenship. Their policy, apartheid and the Bantustan plan. Its logical conclusion, dispossession, impoverishment, and dehumanization. 18 million blacks, 71% of South Africa's total population, had been allocated 14% of the land, fragmented into 10 Bantustans. Every black person would be compelled to accept citizenship of a Bantustan, and being deprived of all citizenship rights in the rest of South Africa, be tolerated as a guest worker, living in the Bantustan and entering South Africa as a migrant laborer.
Destiny believes that the comparison is egregious based on his understanding of apartheid in South Africa. So were the black, Asian and coloured South Africans all citizens of South Africa? Yes, under the 1949 Citizenship Act, all people born in South Africa would by default become South African citizens. This was the case until 1970, when what was called Grand Apartheid or separate development was being legislated. Black South Africans since the early 20th century were continually relegated to and segregated in reserves, and in the 60s and 70s, these were codified into official Bantustans. Black South Africans would be stripped of their South African citizenship and be given the citizenship of their respective Bantustan. The question I asked then, did South African apartheid end in 1970, given that black South Africans no longer held official South African citizenship? Well, Destiny argued no, and that the denaturalization law actually strengthens his argument.
Yeah, but I feel like you're kind of like, that's kind of my point, right? Is that you're doing something to the citizens that live under your country, right? So maybe it is stripping them of citizenship, but you're not like invading and doing something to other people, but these are like your own citizens. This is one of the things that makes it such an egregious, I guess, affront to your rights, right?
Which, sure, denaturalization was something done to existing South African citizens, but the question remains, what about after 1970? Would every subsequent piece of legislation not be apartheid anymore? The government wouldn't be doing it to citizens. Even if you say, sure, they were former citizens so it counts, what about the children born after the Homeland Citizenship Act was passed? Would every non-white child of South Africa that was born in a Bantustan after 1970 not be living in apartheid? Would the African National Congress Youth Wing, which organized a lot of late high schools and university students in the 80s and 90s, not be fighting against apartheid because their membership were all born after the Homeland Citizenship Act? If the South African government hadn't naturalized all those living in South Africa by default in 1949, would Destiny say then, no, actually, Mandela, it wouldn't have been apartheid? If so, this looks like a very flimsy definition of apartheid that its architects and its opponents wouldn't even agree on. In my opinion, it feels as if Destiny has post-hoc rationalized this interpretation of apartheid as a way to cover for his Zionist politics. There are certainly differences between Israeli and South African apartheid, obviously, but those differences don't automatically debunk the argument that Israel is engaging in apartheid. It'd be like if Destiny said the reason why South Africa was doing apartheid and Israel isn't is because South Africa relied on its black population much more economically than Israelis do on the Palestinians. Sure, that's a difference, but not a disqualifying one. A counter-argument you could make is that if apartheid can be enacted on non-citizens, then what makes, I don't know, the US discriminating against Moldovan citizens by not affording them the same rights as US citizens in America? What makes it not apartheid? Forgot to say that part. Well, I feel like the answer is very obvious. The US doesn't control Moldova. They don't, as the Rome Statute puts it, maintain a system of institutionalized racial domination over Moldova. The South African government, despite its rhetoric of separate development, allowing each Bantustan to have its own separate government and even forcibly removing white South Africans from lands allocated to non-white people, retained control over the Bantustans. This, in some respects, hands-off but still authoritative approach is almost perfectly replicated by Israel in the occupied territories, and the Israeli government, like the South African one, has displaced Israelis from Gaza and the West Bank for breaking the boundaries set. While I obviously can't prove that Destiny is invoking pro-South African apartheid rhetoric intentionally, he is nonetheless preaching what was called separate development. It was a doctrine followed by the South African government which allowed it to externalize the consequences of apartheid when it was convenient and reassert authority when needed. Destiny is engaging in the same externalizing tendency, where Palestine is separate and distinct from Israel when it's convenient, but when Israel needs to intervene, they can. By giving the Bantus or the Palestinians their own fragmented mini-states, all of a sudden the central authority isn't responsible for the oppressive system, and by implication, isn't responsible for the knock-on effects of such system. Once again, whether Destiny is or is not intentionally doing this is besides the point. But it's clear that, even trying to refute the apartheid claim, similar rhetoric espoused by the National Party in South Africa is employed when defending the legitimacy of Israeli apartheid.